Well, hello everyone and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. On today's video, the Apple IIc. I introduced this computer about a month ago on the channel. It was hiding under my Christmas tree after I picked it up at the Commodore Club meeting here in the Portland area. I picked up this machine primarily because it has the Alps keyboard, which I was going to transfer onto my other working IIc, but I was told this machine didn't work. But I thought maybe it'd be fun to crack this open, test it out, see if I can get it working, because it'd be nice to have a spare working IIc. If not, this machine will be a parts machine, so no problem if I can't get it working. So let's see if I can get this working with a little troubleshooting. Let's get right to it. The Apple IIc, introduced in 1984, was a big departure in the design language for Apple. They switched to the Snow White design language, which of course made the case slightly off-white color, but also had these vertical lines in the case, which was very distinctive at the time and something that none of the previous Apple IIs had. The design language carried over to the Apple IIgs and all the Macintosh machines as well, like the Mac II Ci you've seen on my channel. But the color of the case was changed from sort of a slightly off-white color to the platinum gray of all the other machines. The reset key and these slotted keys there are made with PBT, so they haven't yellowed, so that's the original Snow White color that this machine should be. Compared to all the Apple IIs before, this had a nice complement of built-in ports, so while you lack any kind of expansion capability, at least on these initial IIcs, you did have a modem and joystick port, you have a serial port, video output digital port. This could be hooked up to an LCD panel, which could actually clip onto the computer. Very hard to find and rare now. Also, there was a digital RGB color output that connected to this as well. You have the composite video output, floppy drive expansion port, printer port, and the power port. And it goes without saying, this thing has a built-in 5¼ inch disk drive, which you just push in and it raises up, stick the disk in, and push down. I saw a video once where a YouTuber got one of these, and they did not know how to open the disk drive, and they were pulling at it and pushing up on it, and I hope they didn't break the machine, because all you got to do is give it a little push and it pops up. Originally there's a sticker here that tells you that, although the sticker is still on here, it's just very worn out. You see a little bit of the writing there. On the bottom of the computer it's a little bit more of the original color, although look how yellowed that serial number sticker is, and it is being held on by tape. The machine has a hodgepodge of screws. There's one missing there. These are very rusty, but that one's not. I think the seller told me that he actually opened this up and he swapped some parts around with other IIcs. So I think these rusty screws aren't originally from this machine. Also a first for Apple IIs, Apple included a volume knob and a headphone jack. Very nice, because on all the previous Apple IIs, there was no way to disable the internal speaker or adjust the volume. So if you were playing a game at night and it had no option for adjusting the sound, that thing was making loud beeps. Apple pitched this machine as small and portable, so of course, they installed a carry handle, which works quite well. The balance is not perfect. The machine sort of hangs at an angle when you hold it, but the handle's chunky and solid feeling, so using this handle you never feel like the machine is going to drop. But an even more cool feature is the handle has a rubbery texture to it, and because of that, Apple designed it to be used as a kickstand. Although I remember when I was young that there was one flaw to using the handle this way. Say you were using a computer like this and you wanted to pull it a little closer to yourself. If you weren't careful, it would drop the computer down the table. All right, first things first, let's plug this into power. So you do need a special Apple IIc power supply. I happen to have one right here. It uses a DIN connector and it runs at about 15 volts. One thing to note if you're troubleshooting one of these yourself, the composite video connection here can become loose and break off from the motherboard. So if you plug in the computer to the monitor, turn it on, and it sounds normal, you hear a beep and a floppy drive noise, but you have no picture, wiggle this around. If you start to see a picture, it's this connection is broke off. You need to solder it on the motherboard and that will fix it. It's a very simple fix. This one feels very secure, so I don't think there's an issue. All right, let's turn this on. All right, so that's not looking great. Right off the bat, the IIc should have garbage for a second, then a black screen where it says Apple IIc at the top. You will hear a beep and the disk drive will seek. You'll hear a noise coming out of the disk drive. Maybe hard to see under the studio lighting, but the power light does have a normal green light, so I don't think that's a problem. I've power cycled the computer again, and it looks basically the same, a little bit different, but similar ugly patterns. There are two things to do to reset a IIc. You either hit Control Reset to go to Basic, or Open Apple, which is this one. This is the Apple that's not filled in. Control Reset. That will restart the computer entirely. You can also push both Apple keys, Control and Reset, to go to a diagnostic mode, but you have to have the newer ROMs on the 2C for that to work. On the older one, it just draws patterns on screen, but it actually doesn't do anything useful. So if I hit Control Reset, it does change things a little bit. Oh, look at that. There are patterns moving through the picture, and hitting Control Reset as I hold it, it freezes everything. So the reset signal appears to be doing something. Now look at that, it dropped into text mode. And when I hold it, one thing that's good is that all the character generation that we see on screen looks correct. We got flashing characters, we have well-formed characters, nothing is screwed up there. So the character generation circuitry seems to be working well, but something is going on that's altering the RAM in a very fast way that clearly is causing these weird patterns. So at this point, we got to open this up and take a look at what's going on inside. So when I was a kid, I was an inquisitive one, but I didn't actually ever open up my 2C. So this will be a first for me, but you know how I like to do it? I'd like to just take out all the screws and we'll go from there. Seems to be some type of a snap in the center here, holding the keyboard together. I have an old gift card here. I use these old credit cards for this kind of purpose, trying to open up things. Aha, look at that. Popped right up. It's great to hold on to expired gift cards because you never know when you're going to need something like a plastic credit card to open up a case. So there's still something back here holding this together. I wonder if it's more clips. I'm getting there. Okay, I think there's just some clips on the back as well. It's almost free. This is all off. It's just sort of binding up around the power switch. Well, the handle's popping out. There you go. You gotta get it around the power switch. That's a little bit tricky with all the clips that they use. All right, quite a compact little machine. Let's lift this keyboard up. Connect it to the motherboard just with a ribbon cable. Nice, there's the bottom of the Alps keyboard. The other keyboards that aren't made by Alps have a strengthening plastic piece, and I don't think it has a metal backplate like this one does. All right, we're getting the first glimpse of part of the motherboard. On the side, we have RAM chips, and there's going to be 16 of them, 8 for 64K and another 8 for 128K that will be under the disk drive. Up at the top here, we have an IOU chip that's in a socket. Then we have an MMU not in a socket. The CPU, which is a 65CO2, that's in a socket. This must be the ROM chip because it's in a socket and it says Microsoft 77 right underneath. Some other IC and another IC. Maybe this is the keyboard controller. It says ENC there. This was the keyboard connector we unplugged. This is the power supply that takes the 15 volts input and generates the 12 volts for the disk drive, 5 volts for the motherboard, things like that. On the bottom of the case, there were 4 screws that go into, I think the disk drive, they were machine screws versus the plastic ones. There's a ribbon cable on this side, which I'll just pop off. And there comes the disk drive. Condition of the drive looks pretty good under here. It's not too dirty and no rust. That reveals the rest of the motherboard, and unfortunately, none of this stuff is socketed. And there's a bunch of custom chips. The rest of the RAM is visible right there. Right here is something that's interesting. This crystal looks like a bit of a mod. You see the silkscreen mark underneath? Looks like that's an IC socket, and there's actually a little extra bodge wire. There's more information online about this, but it turns out that the chip here controlled the serial port timing, and there was a fault with the original design where the port ran too slowly and affected the higher baud rates. So you needed this modification done to the machine to use higher baud rate devices without issue. So I'm glad this had that, because if it didn't, I wouldn't be able to use anything over, I think, 300 baud. So the mod has been done, which is great. So there's the inside of the Apple IIc. I think from a troubleshooting perspective, the very first thing I'm going to do is we're going to take out the socketed chips and I'll reinsert them with some Deoxit. So first I'm just going to inspect all the legs on the ICs. They are definitely a little oxidized. That's the CPU. Here's the IOU chip. That's the custom one. And then we have the ROM chip. And okay, so the pins are quite bent on that side. Yeah, there is a bent pin. I don't know if someone has already tried to reseat all these ICs. That may be the case. But I'm going to pop some Deoxit, my favorite stuff, into these sockets. Nothing gets things working better than a little Deoxit. That in there. Let's pop in the CPU. Let's try to fix this bent pin. Hopefully it doesn't break off. All right, there's the ROM chip. Let's pop this back in. ROM chip has a date code of 1984, so this is probably the very earliest ROMs. Although these chips have early 85s, and the RAM has date codes from the 20th week of 85. Other chips on this board seem later. This ROM chip seems pretty early on. I wonder if maybe this wasn't the original ROM chip in this board. I don't know. Okay, I have no idea if I have to have the keyboard connected to have an Apple IIc work, but it probably works without it. Let's turn this on. No change whatsoever. That's exactly how it looked initially. With the multimeter, let's do a quick voltage check, see if we're getting the correct 5 volts to the ICs. 5.03. Yeah, so that's looking just great. So this doesn't necessarily bode well for me on this machine. There aren't a lot of normal chips on here. Most of this stuff are PAL chips or they're custom ICs, which aren't something I can just find online. But I can still try more troubleshooting, and hopefully it's one of the chips that is easily obtainable that is bad, and I can fix that. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to pull out the ROM chip. I want to see if the behavior of the machine is different without the ROM chip installed. Power cycling the machine, it's a little different, but not that different. We're not getting all of those kind of patterns that are happening so much in the picture. Next, let's pull out the CPU. Let's see how things look now on the screen when I turn on the power. It basically looks identical, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because without the ROM installed, the CPU isn't really going to do anything. It's going to try to execute what the code, that's in the ROM chip, but there's nothing there to execute, so it's just going to do random things, which is essentially nothing. So it's not going to try to initialize anything. And this seems very much the same as when we're holding down the control reset. We have no patterns going, which would indicate there's nothing actually running on the CPU. But with the ROM installed, we were getting those kind of lines and patterns as if the CPU was trying to do something. So I think at this point, this calls for additional troubleshooting on the workbench with the oscilloscope and the logic probe. For the rusty case screws, I am going to treat the rust on the heads by dropping them into this little plastic container with some of this Loctite naval jelly. This is rust dissolver, so we'll just leave this for a while and the rust should disappear. So for troubleshooting the IIc, I have the schematics, my oscilloscope, and the IIc on the bench. So the first thing I want to do is test the data lines, and I've removed the CPU, which is sitting there, and the ROM chip, which is also sitting there. And I'm going to probe the data lines and just see how things are looking. So I had mentioned this earlier, that the Apple IIc has 128K, and to facilitate that, it's split the RAM into 2 different banks, the first 64K and the second 64K. Remember that the 6502 can only address 64K of RAM total. So even the first 64K does some bank switching in the upper part of the memory to swap in and out the ROM chip. On the schematics, the upper 64K is called the aux RAM, and that also gets swapped in and out, and it is isolated from the main processor by an LS245, and then there's also an LS374 latch right here. So these 2 chips. So because the data bus on these upper 64K is isolated by these 2 chips, any problems that I may find up here are not going to be shared necessarily with these lower chips. All right, so if you saw my Commodore 64 testing video, pin 2 and 14 are the data bus lines on these 64K RAM chips. So I'm just going to go through and check pin 2. First, we'll power the machine on. Now we're getting a decent looking signal. And remember that sometimes when the CPU is removed from a machine, you're not going to get any kind of visible data bus signal on the RAM if the RAM's not being refreshed. This is Adrian from the future. I wanted to break in to clarify something about this part of the video. I'm using the term refresh incorrectly. The way the DRAM chips work is a little bit complicated. They require regular refreshing by something else on the motherboard to keep the contents of the RAM alive. This process is called refreshing and is different from instructing the RAM to read out the contents and drive the data bus. You can read more about this on the datasheets for the 4164 DRAM chips, but the short version is that for this type of DRAM, if you don't have activity on the CAS and RAS pins, then it is not possible for the DRAM to be driving the bus. Keep that in mind as you watch the next part of this video. But on the Apple IIc, it seems that even without the processor, the RAM is getting refreshed by the memory management chip on the motherboard. So that looks the same, looks good. That looks good. That looks good as well. That looks fine. That does not look fine. We are on data bit 5 here. So I'm going to note this down and I'm going to keep on going. So that looks definitely screwed up. That looks good. That looks good. 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 That looks very screwed up again. We're up in the aux RAM, the upper 64K. That is definitely not correct. The chip down here next to it, that looks fine. And the one above it looks the same. That That is not good. That one looks fine. That looks fine. And that looks fine. So these are the two chips. So MR D5, that's the main bank of RAM, data bit 5, and AR D5, that's the auxiliary RAM data bus 3. These are the two that look screwed up. So if we focus on auxiliary RAM 3, like I had mentioned, this is the latch here and this LS245 are what isolate the data bus lines. So there's a problem in here, and it's either that the RAM chip is bad or one of these two chips is bad. There is nothing else on that bus. On the main RAM, there's a bunch of chips on the motherboard that could be causing that to be low. So let's focus on the upper 64K, the aux RAM. This is the simplest part of the motherboard. So this is the chip that's bad. We need to figure out what's driving the bus in this little section, because it's just this and these two chips that are on the data bus. If these RAM chips aren't driving that bus and that signal that we see is coming from something else, like say this LS245 is driving the bus instead of these, then the fault could be the LS245. This is the relevant section of the schematic. So here's the RAM chips there. There's the LS374 latch, and there's the LS245. So this thick black line at the bottom, this is the data bus. You see it goes up into here, into the latch, and it goes down here on 245. So first, down on the 245, there's an enable pin, which is pin 15. And if that pin is high, that means the 245 should be turned off and is not driving the bus. So the RAM chips right here, pin 3 is the read-write pin. It goes down to the 245. So that needs to be high for the RAM chip to be driving the bus. And then pin 15 and pin 4 are the refresh signals for the RAM. And RAM isn't going to do anything. It's not going to drive the bus unless you see pulsing going on those pins. So to figure out what's driving the bus, we're going to check the LS245 pin 19. If that's high, that means the 245 is not active. And then we're going to check RAM pin 3, and that's the read-write pin. That needs to be high as well. And that's going to mean that the RAM can drive the bus if it's being refreshed, which is pin 14 and 4. So we need to be seeing pulsing going on there, which is the refresh, the CAS and the RAS for the RAM. So first off, we're going to check pin 19 on the 245, and that is a high signal. So the 245 is not enabled. It's not driving the bus. Next up, we have pin 3 on the RAM, and that is high as well. So the RAM is not being told to read the bus, it's being told to drive the bus. And that is if it's being refreshed, which is pin 4. And look at that, we're seeing a signal there, so it's being refreshed there. And then here's pin 15 on the RAM, which is part of the refresh. So the RAM is definitely being refreshed, even though the CPU is not in here. And I can pretty confidently conclude that this screwed up signal here is that this RAM chip is bad. So jumping down to the main RAM, this is the chip we're having a problem with. And take a look at that. Do you see this leg here? That looks weird. It looks off to the side. Now, it doesn't seem to be moving around, so I don't think it's broken. I don't know what's happening there. All of the markings on these chips are exactly the same. 8520, 20th week of 1985, so nothing looks like it's been replaced. Pin 4 is part of the RAM refresh, so if that's not making contact with the IC inside, that RAM chip's definitely not going to work properly. And if on a 6502 you're missing an entire RAM chip, like it's just not working, the machine won't work at all because you're not going to have the 0 page, which is the very beginning of RAM, or the stack working. So the processor's not going to be able to execute code properly. So with these two chips, since the bus looks like it's probably not being driven properly, I'm going to try the old RAM piggyback method where you lay a RAM chip on top of another one. And these are 64K RAM chips, by the way, which are not as prone to failure as the 16K RAM chips on some of the older computers. Those chips need -5 volts, +5 volts, and 12 volts. And if you try to piggyback and there's not good contact with all the voltage pins, apparently you can damage the chips. But these 64K ones just run at 5 volts. It's much simpler. And I'm just going to try the piggyback method. I've had good luck with this in the past. First, we'll start with aux RAM. I'm going to piggyback the chip, and I'm going to use the oscilloscope to check the LS245 on the appropriate pin so that we'll see if that bus signal is looking better. There's the piggybacked RAM chip. You bend the pins in so it kind of makes good contact, and then usually you have to push down on it with your finger while you're testing just to make sure it's making good contact. I'm going to turn on the power, and then I'm going to measure what we see on bit 3. And look at that. We have a good signal. And if I lift the chip off while the power's on, look at that. It dropped away. And I think that pretty much confirms that that particular chip is bad. So I've overlaid the chip on the bad RAM chip on the main bus, and on the LS245 behind my finger, I can pick up data bit 5 right there. So I'm going to do that while we look at the oscilloscope. Oh, wait a second. I'm maybe not making good contact with this RAM chip. It can be pretty fiddly to get all the pins on, especially this one because it has that weird pin and it has blobbed on solder. So you just sort of have to bend it and move it around. Just try to get some good contact on all of the pins. Look at that. We have a good signal with this chip on there, and if I pull it off while holding the oscilloscope probe, it disappears. So that to me says that that chip is bad as well. Oh, MT! Oh, MT RAM chips! The bane of 8-bit computers. Bah! So at this point, I'm pretty confident that these two chips are bad. So it's time to remove this from the case and remove those chips and put some new chips in. Well, there we have one Apple IIc motherboard. Top side's in pretty good shape. Bottom side looks clean, at least there's no filth or corrosion. But take a look at this. Ugly rework has been done on the main RAM. There's even like a little bit of residue left from the cleaning. At least they cleaned up the flux. You can see there some of the solder mask has been removed on that copper trace. This looks pretty crusty. And guess what? The reworked chip? Which one is it? This one right here, MRD5. This is the one we're having problems with. What's interesting is notice the date code. It's exactly the same as all these other chips. So I wonder if this rework was done at the factory. Something like that. I don't know. But that would explain why that one pin looks all screwy as well. I'm going to take out the 5 one and I'll take out the aux chip over here as well. So like I always do, I'm going to mark the board with the chip I need to remove so I don't accidentally remove the pins on the wrong chip. And then this is the aux RAM that's bad. It's right by this hole, and it's definitely not been reworked. That's an original chip. Well, wow. So auxiliary RAM bit 3, this one came out pretty easily. This is definitely nice and clean, nothing damaged. But over here on the main RAM, what a freaking mess. So first off, here's the chip I took out. I didn't break that leg off. And take a look. The bottom of the case is broken as well. And that was not me. Worse off, that leg I thought was suspect, yeah, that one was broken. That's the one that huge chunk is missing. And it stayed behind in the motherboard here. But also, this Wiha right here is missing. The pad is completely gone. Luckily, this is the data bit 3 output, which is joined to this pin right here. But yeah, this is pretty crap. So I got to remove this leg. And then when I put the socket in, I will add a bodge on the underside to connect these pins back together again. Was this a fix the Apple dealer did? This is crap. All right, first to get this pin out. So all I need to do is just use some tweezers and the soldering iron. We heat it up and we'll be able to pull that right out of the board here. There we go, it came right out. What a mess. So I have the motherboard back in the case temporarily. It's just sitting here. And the sockets that I want to install are not soldered into the board yet. They're just sitting in there. Now, one of the issues with the Apple IIc is that the floppy drive sits over the motherboard. And I'm pretty sure if we place this in, there is very low clearance under the disk drive. And I'm pretty sure that if I put a RAM chip in that socket and I solder that to the motherboard, this disk drive will no longer sit here. Luckily, this front one here is out from under the drive, so there would be no problem with me putting a socket there. But I think under the disk drive, it's not going to work. You can kind of get an idea of how little space there is right there. You see the RAM chip, there's hardly any clearance. But I'm going to put a RAM chip in the socket just to see what happens. So this RAM chip is just sitting in there, and let's see what happens when we stick the disk drive on top of it. Well, interesting is the drive seems to be sitting completely down, but I'm concerned that under the drive, obviously there's a bit of extra clearance in the middle section here, not on the edges. But what if that chip is up against, one of these components like this thing here? That's going to cause a problem. Okay, I'm going to try something. I have a little piece of Scotch tape in this line, adhesive side up. I'm going to put the disk drive down, and if I pull the disk drive up and it's stuck to the bottom of the disk drive, then I'm pretty confident the drive is actually sitting on that chip. So there we go. It's fully down in the cavity. Let's lift this up. Oh, look. It's not. It's not stuck to anything. So I guess that works. Because look, if I just touch this ever so lightly with my pick, it lifts it right up. So I guess I'm safe and I can install that in a socket and it will clear the disk drive. That's really lucky. As a side note, I know there are low profile sockets you can get that are quite a bit lower than this. I just don't have any, so I'm gonna have to use these. All right, for soldering things like sockets, people have suggested many times I use blue tack, which I have found to be pretty darn good solution. You just glob that on and it holds these down into place. So you just can solder a pin or two on the bottom side and then peel the blue tack off before you do the rest. Incidentally, my TS100 soldering iron is fixed. There's actually was nothing wrong with it. The cable was bad. So remember how I said on main RAM 5, it looked like there was a bad pad there for this second pin? Well, normally, if we look at one of these chips right here, pin 2 and pin 14 are common. So we get a beep there. And let's just check that on this. Oh, okay, it's working as well. So I guess that even though that pad was bad on the top side, it's probably okay on the bottom. All right, time to partially assemble this so we can test it. So this power supply module goes in like that. I have two good RAM chips here from my parts collection. We'll insert these into these two sockets. So one there and one right there. I have the power connected, the multimeter negative connected. I'm going to leave the CPU and the ROM out again. And let's check those two bits. Power on. So this is the chip right below. 4. Looks good. And 5. Oh yeah, looks good as well. 6. That looks good. And then up here we have data bit 2. That was one of the existing RAM chips. Looks fine. 3. Okay. 4. Yeah, okay. So everything is looking good, at least on the RAM. I'm going to put the CPU and the ROM back in, and we're going to see if this thing does anything different when we have the monitor connected. All right, moment of truth, everyone. Oh, okay. So yes, this is not booting per se, but this is the diagnostics on the 2C where you hold down open Apple, closed Apple, control, reset, you get this. So I have a feeling without the keyboard connected, we're probably getting this test pattern, which on the ROM 255, which is the original ROMs, doesn't do anything except for this particular pattern. So this is a great sign, great sign. So I put the disk drive back in, and that's because the keyboard, to put this in, it slots into the disk drive right here. So you need to have it in place. Otherwise, the keyboard's just going to flop around. A little Deoxit, the keyboard connector. All right, keyboard's in place. And let's turn this on. Will it boot? Will we hear that beep and the clicking, or will we just see an issue? Here we go. Oh, look! Apple IIc! Oh, yes. It freaking works! So as I had mentioned before, that weird pattern we saw initially, if I hold down Open Apple Control Reset, we will get that same diagnostic pattern. There it is. And I guess the Apple II and the keyboard's unplugged just goes straight into this mode, but you just connects it out of it by pushing Control Reset. Thumbs up! So this machine has the original 16K ROM, the one that makes that pattern, which is completely not useful. The later ROMs, the ROM version 0, which is interesting because that's the second ROM for the 2C, that actually has a diagnostic, so it tells you if any of the RAM is bad. I found a great article on Big Meso Wires on how to upgrade the Apple IIc ROM. I'll put a link in the description so you can read this yourself. The article goes into detail about the different ROM versions, which 255 is the one on this machine and 0 is the one I want to upgrade to. There's a way in BASIC to check which ROM version you have as well, so that might be helpful for you. To upgrade the ROM, all you need is a 32K EEPROM, which is a 27C256. But since the original ROM is only 16K, you have to make two small changes to the motherboard to enable support for the 32K EEPROM. You have to cut through a trace on W1 here, and then you have to add a solder blob to W2. The article goes into detail about exactly how to do this. There's the cut on W1 and the solder blob on W2. So I flashed a new EEPROM for the computer, and I'm going to go ahead and do these mods to the motherboard so I can use it. To facilitate the upgrade, we have to cut this little trace right here in between these two triangles, and then we need to add a little blob of solder right here on W2, and that enables the 32K ROM. I'll just use an X-Acto blade to cut through the triangle here. The mod is done. I'm just going to pop this ROM chip out of here, the original one, and insert my 32K EEPROM. And here we are. Turn this back on. It's booting, which means that the ROM is working. Now if I put open Apple, closed Apple, control, reset, it should actually run a RAM diagnostic. Ah, yeah, see, it looks different now. Nice. System okay. Thumbs up. That's what it should do. There's a couple ways to check for your ROM version, but one of the easiest ways is just type PR number 7. And if you have ROM 0, it'll say Apple Talk offline. But if you have ROM 255, what it allows you to do is boot off the external floppy drive that's plugged in. I like that ability in case the internal drive's not working, but I think having the built-in diagnostics is probably worth not being able to boot off an external floppy drive. What I want to do next is clean the floppy drive. So get out my old cleaning floppy that I was using on the Compaq and give it some 99% IPA here into the machine. There's that sound as it's cleaning those heads. Let's turn this over. Let's add a little more alcohol. Turn it over and try the other side. Check disk drive. Now let's try a real floppy disk. I connected up a mouse that works on the Apple IIc. This is actually a Mac mouse, but some of these do work on the IIc. I don't have an original IIc mouse anymore, and they're ridiculously expensive. Let's put in a copy of DazzleDraw. Ah, look, it crashed into the monitor ROM. So I'm wondering if that particular ROM chip I burned is not perfect. Let's open Apple Control, reset the machine. Now, like it's booting normally now. DazzleDraw, very nice. Anyone ever remember using this program back in the day? So it's a paint program, and yep, the mouse is working. So you got a paintbrush, and you pick colors. This is double high res mode. So you get actual colors that you're not getting on a regular Apple II. You only get it on the 2C or the enhanced 2E, 2GS of course. Yes, look at my beautiful artwork. Ha 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 ha, terrible actually. Here's an old copy of Epic Summer Games. Let's put this in the machine and use this as a test. Oh, I better turn the volume down. I don't want to get a copyright strike for the Olympics fanfare theme, but yep, it's definitely working, the sound. I love this in the game. West Germany. Okay. It's old. Adrian. Pick my country. Well, I'm going to pick Canada because, of course, that's where I'm from. I like how that's in the center, too. Yeah, thumbs up to that. So the 2C is doing something strange. Every time I power cycle it, it randomly goes right into basic or crashes into monitor instead of booting normally. So I have the 2C over here hooked up to the monitor because I've been running some tests on it, just letting games run for a while, using the computer. Everything seems to be working perfectly on here. So I did a little bit of reading about how the boot up reset procedure works on the Apple II. Let's turn this off and turn it back on. So it just went right to basic here. And actually, it sort of didn't quite work, but it turned off and on again. Let's get it to not. There we go, booted straight into basic. So what happens when you power on an Apple II is it takes a look at a specific memory location, and then it determines, based on what's in that memory location, whether your computer is doing a cold start, which is basically a full boot up, or a warm start. Hitting Control Reset like that is what's considered a warm start. So it just exits out of whatever you're running and goes back to basic. It doesn't clear memory, doesn't do any of that stuff. We drop into the assembler with call 151 and we look at memory location 03F4. This is the memory location it's checking. If it sees this location as 45, and I think it does an XOR or something to it, then what happens is when you hit control reset, it will just drop into basic. I can demonstrate that because if I go in here and we change this memory location, so F4, and we put this to 00, for instance, 03F4 now is 00. When I hit control reset, the computer reboots. And let's type Adrian was here, just onto the screen like that. Let me turn it off and on. And look at this, Adrian was here, syntax error. Now, some of it's corrupted. So the RAM on this computer, while it was powered off just briefly, was able to maintain some of the contents of RAM. And my hypothesis is that I'm power cycling the machine and that memory location is not clearing this content, or it's not getting corrupted enough that when I power the machine back on, it's still 45, which just causes a warm boot, even though I just power cycled the machine. And it's why when pushing Open Apple Control Reset, it forces a cold start, which does this, as opposed to this, which is a warm start. So that's my hypothesis. The fact that I just turned the power off, on and off, and it still says check disk drive, and we only have a little bit of corruption here, a few bits have gone bad, that's what I'm thinking is happening. If you think different or you have another hypothesis, I'd love to hear it in the comment section below, but I think that's what's going on this particular Apple IIc. So it's Adrian from the future again. I'm showing here the Apple II technical manual from archive.org, and this talks about the very specific reset process that I'm talking about. The Auto Start ROM was added to the Apple II Plus line to allow the machine to boot fully off a disk when you first turn it on, because the original Apple IIs actually behaved a lot more like what my IIc is doing sometimes on power up. And the specific section of this that refers to what I'm talking about is right here. It says, at this point, the Auto Start ROM peeks into two special locations in memory to see if it's been reset before or if the Apple has just been powered up. If the Apple has just been turned on, the Auto Start ROM performs a cold start. Otherwise, it does a warm start. This page here talks about the special memory locations, and there it is, 03F4. This is the power up byte, normally contains 45. And right here it says, when the Apple is powered up, the Auto Start ROM places a special value in the power up location. I asked my friend IZ8WDF if his Apple IIc has the same behavior as mine, and he confirms that it does. He also told me that it's very normal for 4164 RAM chips to have a lot of persistence of memory after the power is removed. And that goes back to exactly what I was saying. When the computer sets this 45 value when it powers on, what happens is if you power it off and you power it back on, if this memory location doesn't decay and change to some other value, when you turn the computer on, it's going to check and peak this power up value, and when it finds 45, it just does a warm start, which just drops you at the basic prompt. The persistence of memory that happens on DRAM chips when you remove power will vary from brand to brand and probably even manufacturing day to manufacturing day. So if you have a IIc or another Apple II that doesn't do this, that's probably normal for your machine. But just depending on what kind of RAM chips you have, this problem could be exacerbated. Of course, just leaving the computer off for 30 seconds or a minute will definitely clear all the memory and this problem won't happen. But a quick power cycle definitely can cause this issue. Hitting Open Apple Control Reset will definitely do a cold start every time. So if you have an Apple II that does this, don't worry, it's normal, and just reboot it normally to get it started. Let's check on these screws. Well, this appeared to have worked really well already. That stuff works fast. Look at that. That looks good. Let me wash these off. Here are the screws all washed off. I've turned up the exposure so you guys can see a little more clearly. But look at that. This was in there for maybe an hour. These look great now. They've lost their shiny coating, so I'm just going to hit them with a little Rust-Oleum spray paint just to make sure they don't rust again. I want to take a closer look at these two bad RAM chips I removed. So this was the one from the top auxiliary RAM, and this chip looks totally fine physically on the outside. No issues whatsoever. Pins are a little bent up just because that was from the desoldering process, but there's definitely no physical issues with this chip whatsoever. On the other hand, this particular chip, I can't quite say that. But there's that missing pin, right? And flipping this chip over, we can get a good view. How the heck did this huge chunk come out of this chip? Also, check out this part here. At first, I thought this was some deoxit that was still on the chip. But actually, I realized I didn't spray any deoxit. But it's a very shiny, kind of melted part of the IC. So actually, whatever that is does scratch off. You can see the little reminiscences here on the mat. So I scraped it with this pick. What exactly is that? I don't know. Incidentally, remember I said there was a missing pad from the Apple IIc? Well, actually the Wiha is on the pin still. There it is. This is actually the little Wiha, or part of it at least, right there. So that was on the motherboard and that came out. Although I was very gentle with the way I removed this. So this must have been damaged already from whatever happened to this chip beforehand. This blown out part of the chip, though, is the most interesting. And remember I said this was one of the refresh pins? So this RAM chip might have just been bad simply because the refresh wasn't getting into the IC itself because of this, whatever happened here. So anyhow, those are the two chips that were bad in the Apple IIc, and I'm glad it was a pretty simple fix. Time to reassemble the IIc. Here's the Magnetics EEPROM holding the new ROM image, and a lot of people always scream at me, "You didn't cover the glass window, it's going to get erased," which is really silly. I mean, it's inside a computer that's closed up in a case. No light, especially the correct wavelength of UV light's going to hit this. Just to appease those people, I did put a piece of tape, and I wrote IIc ROM 0 on here, more for my information. And this is the extra ROM chip. There was a little part of the motherboard that had no components on it, so I stuck a piece of anti-static foam, and I put some double-sided tape on there, so that's going to stay there. That way I won't misplace it. Here are the rusty screws that have been de-rusted and now painted. They look pretty good. For now, I'm going to put the Alps keyboard back in this machine. I will take this apart again in the summertime so I can do the retro bright on the case, and that's when I'll clean this Alps keyboard and put it into my other really nice mint condition 2C. Unfortunately, I'm noticing this is a bit chewed up right here. That's where that one clip is that I released with the gift card earlier in the video, but look, it's all chewed up. So someone obviously used a metal tool to open this up at some point. So that's not very nice. Well, that's going to be it for this video. Troubleshooting and fixing an Apple IIc. I found it really fun, and this was actually the first time I've ever done that type of work on an Apple II. But of course, with these 8-bit computers, it's all relatively similar, so Commodore 64, Apple II, and not that much different. I think this was also my first video on my channel dealing with an Apple II, so that's kind of cool, unless I'm mistaken. I mean, there was the Apple III, but anyhow, I wanted to say hello and welcome to a large number of new subscribers that I got after posting my last Commodore 64 video. Welcome to the channel, and thank you very much for subscribing. And then, if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And of course, if you didn't, you know what to do. You can hit that thumbs down button. You can subscribe for more videos and hit that little bell icon if you want to get notified when I post new ones. You can put your comments and your suggestions down in the comment section below. I do read all the comments, so thank you very much for doing that. And then that's it. So thanks for watching, have a good night, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.